Close your eyes and imagine it's October 1962. The smell of burning leaves fills the air, and the world is holding its breath. On television, you see President John F. Kennedy looking tense, speaking about Soviet missiles in Cuba. Newspapers scream warnings of possible war. Neighbors whisper rumors about bomb shelters and stockpiling food. Behind closed doors, leaders in Washington and Moscow are playing a deadly game. One wrong move, and the world could plunge into nuclear chaos. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when everything we knew and loved balanced on the razor's edge of total annihilation. Our story begins long before 1962. The Cold War had simmered for years, fueled by mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. Each side built more bombs, more missiles, more warplanes. People around the globe felt the tension, but nobody expected the crisis that would bring humanity so close to destruction. Then came the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Fidel Castro took power, and within a few short years, Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union, America's biggest rival. Suddenly, that Cold War superpower was just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. To Washington, it was like discovering a loaded gun pointed right at their back door. Early in October 1962, U.S. spy planes flying over Cuba snapped photos of something that set alarm bells ringing in the White House. Hidden among palm trees and muddy roads were long, cylindrical objects, missiles, pointed toward America. The Soviets had brought nuclear weapons onto Cuban soil. If launched, they could obliterate major U.S. cities within minutes. President Kennedy met in secret with his closest advisors. They sifted through blurry photographs, analyzing missile ranges and possibly death tolls. Late-night phone calls crackled with tension. Some generals pushed for an immediate airstrike, even an invasion. Others worried that any military action would trigger a Soviet counterattack and possibly nuclear war. Kennedy was at a crossroads. Launch an attack and risk a global catastrophe, or do nothing and risk letting the Soviets gain a deadly advantage in America's backyard. The decision pressed down on his shoulders, a choice that could save or doom millions of lives. He paced the Oval Office, weighing advice from his brother Robert, from top generals, and from trusted advisors. American bombs had ended World War II in Japan less than 2 decades earlier. Could that kind of horror happen again, but now on an unimaginable scale? On October 22, 1962, Kennedy went on national television. His calm voice belied the panic roiling beneath. He announced a quarantine of Cuba, a naval blockade. No more Soviet ships would be allowed to deliver missiles or military equipment to the island. If any tried to break through, the U.S. Navy was poised to stop them by force if necessary. Across the world, people listened with pounding hearts. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev blasted the blockade as an act of war. Soviet ships loaded with missile parts continued streaming toward Cuba. The world collectively asked, would American destroyers open fire? Would this spark the final war? Inside the White House, the lights never seemed to go off. Advisors stayed up until dawn, cigarettes piling in ashtrays, coffee cups overflowing. Outside in the streets of America, families crouched by their radios, eyes glued to news reports. Teachers ran nuclear drills with their students, telling them to hide under desks as if that would shield them from an atomic blast. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, U.S. ships formed a line at sea. Each hour that passed felt like an eternity. Closer and closer came the Soviet freighters and cargo ships. Would they turn back? Would they push ahead? Would the U.S. dare to fire if they didn't stop? October 24th arrived, Blockade Day. All eyes were locked on that ring of American warships around Cuba. Every minute the tension soared. You could almost hear the ticking of a clock in the background. The Soviets had to decide, risk a shootout that might lead to a nuclear exchange or back off. Some Soviet captains slowed their engines, stalling in the waters. Back in Moscow, Khrushchev wrestled with the same fears Kennedy faced in Washington. Neither leader wanted nuclear war, but neither wanted to lose face. Pride clashed with survival, while billions watched and hoped for peace. As the standoff dragged on, lesser-known incidents piled up. A U.S. spy plane accidentally veered into Soviet airspace over Serbia, nearly provoking the Red Army. Another U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. That single death threatened to spiral the crisis out of control. Would the Americans retaliate? In Florida, American troops prepared invasion plans. Jets stood ready on airfields, loaded with bombs and itching to strike if given the order. On the island of Cuba, Soviet soldiers and Cuban militia dug trenches and lined beaches, expecting a hail of American bullets and bombs at any moment. While the world braced for doom, quiet negotiations buzzed behind the scenes. President Kennedy's brother Robert secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin in Washington. Together they worked out a possible compromise. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the U.S. vowed never to invade the island. But there was another piece to this puzzle: American missiles stationed in Turkey. Khrushchev wanted them gone too. Kennedy hesitated. Removing them could look like weakness, but it might save the world. Time was running short. Every hour felt like a final hour. By October 27th, the crisis teetered on a knife's edge. In some corners, they call it Black Saturday. Soviet missiles in Cuba were nearly operational. American bombers were fueled and ready for action. Khrushchev sent two messages, one more conciliatory, one more demanding. Which one would Kennedy respond to? At the White House, confusion reigned. Should they respond with force to the downed U-2 pilot, or should they take the offer that might end the crisis? Every decision could be the last straw, and the nuclear clock was seconds from midnight. Finally, President Kennedy chose to accept the Soviets' simpler proposal: remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade. Privately, his brother made it known that American missiles in Turkey would quietly be withdrawn later. Khrushchev recognized that the gamble had gone too far, announced the missiles would be dismantled and shipped back. Relief washed over the planet. No warships exchanged fire. No nuclear warheads lit up the sky. The crisis was over, though the scars would remain for years to come. The Cuban Missile Crisis left a mark on every leader and every citizen who lived through it. In the aftermath, the United States and Soviet Union signed a treaty to limit nuclear tests, and they set up a direct hotline so their leaders could communicate instantly. The memory of how close they came to nuclear war sobered them, at least for a while. Fidel Castro felt sidelined, upset that the Soviets and Americans made deals involving Cuba without him. Meanwhile, Khrushchev was seen by many Soviets as having backed down, which weakened his grip on power. Kennedy, although hailed as a hero by some, carried the burden of knowing the world had danced within inches of ruin. The Cuban Missile Crisis teaches us a chilling lesson. A few men locked in rooms making hush-hush decisions can hold the fate of millions in their hands. Pride, fear, and ambition nearly drove the two greatest powers on Earth to destroy each other, and the rest of the world along with them. How did we come so close? Because each side doubted the other's intentions. Because both sides let smaller crises like the Bay of Pigs snowball into bigger ones. And because in the face of terror, people often double down instead of stepping back. In those tense days of October 1962, civilization stood on the brink. We got lucky. Today we can look back and see how quickly events spun out of control, how each decision seemed to push the world closer to nuclear fire. It's a stark reminder that nations wielding massive power must handle their differences with care. For 13 days, a small Caribbean island became the center of a global crisis. And in a final hour, the leaders on both sides chose negotiation over devastation. And so the world stepped back from the brink. Leaders breathed a sigh of relief, and the sun rose on a day that might never have otherwise come. Yet the echoes of those 13 days never truly faded. To this day, they whisper a haunting question: How close are we to the edge, and how easily could we tumble over? Some answers lie in the past, others are still waiting to be uncovered. Like, subscribe, and share for more stories waiting to be deciphered.